rock and roll to On the Dole. Grant and I were getting a good selection of songs together, but there was no income coming from it, and I needed some money. There was some money due to me, but I couldn't be accessed because Type Box Limited, the Frankie Holden company, was in receivership. The country was slipping into recession and the interest rate was going up, and Claire and I were worrying about how we were going to pay our ever increasing mortgage. I wasn't earning any money, and Claire couldn't work because baby number two had just arrived. Lucy Moon was born on the 2nd of March 1990. She'd be one of the few good things that happened that year. I was going to provide for my family. When I left Liverpool Corporation, I had done so before I actually finished my apprenticeship. I had the college qualifications to say I was an electrician, but I didn't have any union cards or anything like that. If I did then, I could have picked up the Evening Standard and got a job on a site somewhere. I had to go out and buy some tools and try and set myself up as a self-employed electrician. I put an advert in the local paper and waited for the phone to ring. I did get the odd call, and although I was capable of doing the work, I had no clue about pricing. I had no trade account set up to get me materials on credit, and even though some work was coming in, it was nowhere near enough to pay the escalating mortgage. Interest rates were increased monthly to try and arrest the slide into recession. The mortgage payments were being covered by the bank, but every month saw us slide further into debt. We had an £800 monthly mortgage payment, and this would double over the course of the next year. We'd have to sell the house. The prospect of what would happen after that was terrifying. I was 27 years old with a wife and two kids, and we could be homeless before the year was out. Where would we live? I envisioned us living in a one-room bed and breakfast in King's Cross, or having to go back to Liverpool and live with Claire's mum. The phone gets cut off, and now I have no way of earning any money. Just when things seemed hopeless, a lifeline appeared on the horizon. Some years earlier, at Claire's friend's wedding, I was introduced to Kevin Ray. At that time, Kevin was a record plugger based in Liverpool and working the northwest area. I didn't know anyone else at the wedding, and we spent the night talking about music and football. He was a Red, so we had a lot in common. I get a phone call from him because he's now based down in London and working for a record label called Swanyard in Islington. He asks what I'm up to and invites me down to see him and have a few beers. I meet him and another Scouser, Keith Knowles, at their offices. They offered us some time in their own recording complex at the end of the alley. There were no real commitments at that time, but at least it was a step forward. Grant and I had been recording stuff in my house, but the equipment was lacking and the chance to upgrade the recordings would be just what we needed. During this time, I'd make an acquaintance that would open up a great musical door. When I moved up to North London, I'd spend my Saturday lunchtime playing snooker with my brother-in-law Kevin and his two pals Jamie and Tony. We've been doing this on and off for the last couple of years. We play a few frames at Whetstone Snooker Club and then head into North Finchley to catch the football results and have a few beers. One of these Saturdays would be etched into my memory forever when we headed down to the Tilted Glass on the 15th of April 1989. We arrived in the pub to see the live pictures from Hillsborough on the TV. The semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest had been stopped minutes into the game. Initial suggestions were that it was crowd trouble, but it didn't look like that on the screen. From my experience, it looked like a crush, but we didn't know then that 94 people had been declared dead before sunset. It'd be 95 deaths 4 days later. It would be another 4 years before Tony Bland, a victim who'd been in a coma since the disaster, would have his life support switched off. The total had reached 96, a number that the city of Liverpool would never forget. I didn't know at the time that my dad was at the game and was in the Leppings Lane end where the tragedy happened. What I did know was that before I left the pub, FA Chief Executive Graham Kelly would appear at a press conference and blame the Liverpool fans. They were accused of forcing a gate, and this had led to a crush. The misinformation had begun. The deceased were not yet cold, and Kelly had appeared on national TV and declared the culprits to be their fellow fans. I don't know how Graham Kelly feels about that statement now, but I believe it was the first thing that the press seized upon and set the tone for some of the disgusting headlines that followed in the coming days. I didn't read The Sun before Hillsborough, and I haven't since. The majority of Merseyside have not read it since either. I don't want to write about their newspaper, or their headlines, or their lying editor, so if you want to find out more, then Google it. As I write, the wheels of justice may be turning slowly for the families of the victims of Hillsborough. All of us want justice and truth, but it is the families who deserve it. I salute their persistence and dogged resolution in their search for the truth. I only have to think about that day and it gets me emotional. I'm not a weepy or emotional person, but thinking about it makes my eyes start to sting. I spoke to my dad the next day and was shocked to find out he'd been there. He'd managed to get a ticket and a lift sorted, so we went. He was in the seats above the terrace where the disaster happened. He said it was bedlam outside the ground. He tried twice to get close to the turnstile and got pushed out again. He got close on his third attempt but still couldn't get in. He was about to give it up when a big lad in front of him recognised his struggle and said, "Here, mate, get in here," and got him through the turnstile. Claire and I drove up to Liverpool on the Monday and went to Anfield. I walked around the pitch with Lois in my arms and walked towards the Kop. My dad was with us and shot a roll of black and white photographs of the famous terrace that was now a shrine to the deceased. From the tributes you could tell this was a tragedy that had touched everyone. The red and blue halves of Merseyside cried together, and supporters from all over the world sent condolences and flowers. Justice for the 96. You'll never walk alone. This reintroduction of football leads me back to Whetstone Snooker Club and the beginning of my relationship with Johnny West, the club's manager. John was, and still is, a fanatical Millwall supporter. Every time I would enter the club he'd say, "Oi, Scarce, when you coming down the den?" He was a top man and still the only proper Cockney I know by the Bow Bells definition. I used to take Lois up there when I was out walking her and have a pint while she sat on the bar and got chocolate biscuits from John. I was telling him about our home recordings and asked if he knew anyone who had a decent mic we could borrow. He told me there was a guy who came in the club that was a singing pianist and gave me his number. This guy was Steve Broughton and he'd become one of my best pals. I turned up at the club and borrowed a microphone from him and he just asked me to drop it at his house when we were finished. What a top geezer. 20 years on and he's still a top geezer, but more of him later. John would introduce me to another musician, Simon Watson. He was an amazing guitarist and we became good mates too. 20 years on and he's also one of my best buddies. Meeting him would result in meeting some of the most talented and lovely musicians I have ever worked with. We did a bit more work on our home recordings with the benefits of Steve's microphone and had a weekend booked in Swan Yard Studios. They liked what they heard, so we did some more and eventually they were convinced enough to sign us. Grant and I were very confident of the songs and Kevin and Keith were into the project and it looked like a perfect match. We were initially going to record a single, then they would decide whether they wanted to commit to an album. Swan Yards were a small independent label, so there was no big advance coming. They did agree to put us on a wage though and we negotiated £350 a week each. This wage would save my bacon. I wasn't out of the woods and the bank was still paying the mortgage, but the debt was increasing. The house was still for sale, but we had no takers. It would only be a matter of time before we were going to be repossessed. The wage did mean that I could sign off the dole. I'd only ever claimed benefit for the 6 weeks that followed me leaving school, but the shortage of cash meant that I had to sign on. There were complications though. I couldn't get unemployment benefit because I was still a company director of Type Box and therefore employed. I ended up getting something else, but I can't remember what it was called. I had to visit them every couple of weeks for an assessment to show how I'd been trying to gain employment. I'd type up a list of meetings that I'd invented and they'd leave me alone. Thankfully, it was only a short time. We sold the house for about 15 grand more than we paid for it, but we had to put about that much into the property, so we were breaking even. We sold it 2 weeks before it was due to be repossessed. The debt to the bank was still outstanding though. They'd been covering the mortgage payments and we owed them over 30 grand with no means of paying it back. I told them there was a deal in the pipeline and they froze the interest and they said they'd wait. We were not in great shape, but compared to others that experienced that recession, I think we got off lightly. We moved into a rented house in nearby Chanctonbury Way and we were eligible for housing benefit. We were really lucky because it was cheap for the area because it was a little run down, but it had the benefit of a huge garden that would be great for the girls. In the space of 3 years, I'd gone from being the guitarist in a band that sold millions of records in the UK alone to starting all over again at the bottom of the ladder and living off state benefit and using milk tokens in Tesco. Still, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, doesn't it? You can only improve from here.